Have you ever wondered what Nazi Germany really thought of the American soldiers they were about to face in World War II? It wasn't exactly a glowing review. German military leaders, steeped in a rigid authoritarian tradition, looked at the American GI and saw, well, they saw a mess. They saw soldiers who chewed gum, slouched, and called their officers by their first names. They saw a civilian army, a hodgepodge of backgrounds, and they predicted it would crumble under the first real test of combat. They believed their own soldiers, indoctrinated from youth in a militaristic ideology, were simply a superior fighting force. But as history would prove, this was one of the most colossal miscalculations of the entire war. The very qualities they sneered at, the individualism, the casual demeanor, the melting pot of cultures, turned out to be America's secret weapons. Let's rewind to the pre-war era. The German military machine, the Wehrmacht, was the most feared in the world. Their doctrine of blitzkrieg, or lightning war, had steamrolled across Europe. Their soldiers were professional, disciplined, and bred for war. When they analyzed their future American opponents, their intelligence reports painted a picture of a society softened by consumerism and democracy. They saw a nation of individuals, not a unified fighting collective. A captured German report famously described American prisoners of war as being surprisingly soft, complaining about the lack of comfort and seemingly not hardened for the rigors of battle. They believed this perceived lack of discipline and toughness would make the American soldier an easy opponent on the battlefield. They saw a nation of jazz-loving, gum-chewing individualists who couldn't possibly stand up to the might of the Third Reich. First major clash in North Africa in 1943 seemed to confirm their bias. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass, inexperienced American troops were dealt a humiliating defeat by Rommel's veteran Afrika Corps. The Germans were confident. This was exactly what they had expected. The Americans were disorganized, their command was shaky, and their equipment was, in some cases, inferior. It was a brutal wake-up call for the Allies, but for the Germans, it was proof of their own superiority. They thought the war in the West was as good as won, but they failed to understand something fundamental about the American character, a deep-seated ability to learn, adapt, and innovate, especially under pressure. Kasserine Pass wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of a transformation. The U.S. Army didn't break, it got better fast. In the aftermath, ineffective commanders were replaced, training was intensified, tactics were completely overhauled based on the brutal lessons learned in the desert. The Americans started to figure it out. They learned how to coordinate their artillery, air power, and infantry in ways the Germans had never anticipated. This adaptability was something the rigid German command structure simply couldn't match. While German doctrine was handed down from the top, Bergen junior officers and even non-commissioned officers were encouraged to take initiative. This flexibility became a decisive advantage. Then came the Normandy landings, D-Day. This was the ultimate test. Here, the American soldier's true character shone through. On beaches like Omaha, facing horrific casualties and with initial plans completely falling apart, it wasn't high command that won the day. It was the sergeants, the corporals, and the privates, small groups of men, often leaderless. Rallied together, they improvised, they pushed forward, and they breached Hitler's Atlantic Wall through sheer grit and determination. They were using their initiative, that very individualism the Germans had dismissed as a weakness. A German officer observing the chaos on Omaha Beach later remarked that his own men would have been paralyzed without orders, but the Americans just kept coming. This pattern repeated itself across France. The American GI proved to be a master of improvisation. When their Sherman tanks were found to be outmatched by the German Tigers and Panthers, what did they do? Tank crews and mechanics in the field started welding scrap metal and sandbags onto their tanks for extra armor, creating makeshift jumbos. When the dense hedgerows of Normandy stalled their advance, it wasn't a general in a far-off headquarters who solved the problem. It was a creative sergeant named Curtis Cullen who welded steel dust from German beach obstacles onto the front of a Sherman tank, creating the rhino that could plow through the hedgerows. This kind of bottom-up innovation was happening all over the front. It was the American act for tinkering, for problem-solving, that the German high command had completely failed to account for. And let's talk about the soldiers themselves. The American Army was a true melting pot. It had farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, recent immigrants from Italy and Poland, Ivy League graduates, and cowboys from Texas. The Germans saw this diversity as a weakness, a lack of racial and cultural purity that they believed made their own Aryan soldiers superior. They couldn't have been more wrong. This diverse mix of backgrounds created a force with an incredible range of skills. Mechanics knew how to fix engines under fire, farmers knew the terrain, and city kids were street smart and resourceful. They learned from each other, they looked out for each other, and they forged a unique and powerful bond of brotherhood born not of ideology, but of shared experience and a common goal. They weren't fighting for a fanatical ideology, they were fighting to get a dirty job done so they could go home. And that motivation proved to be far more resilient. The Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944 was perhaps the final definitive proof. The Germans threw everything they had left into one last, desperate offensive, catching the Americans completely by surprise. The initial attack was devastating, but once again, the American soldier didn't break. Surrounded, outnumbered, and freezing in the Ardennes forest, units that were cut off just kept fighting. The legendary defense of Bastogne by the 101st Airborne is the most famous example. When the German commander demanded their surrender, the American commander, General McAuliffe, gave a one-word reply that has gone down in history: nuts. It was an act of defiance that perfectly encapsulated the American spirit. It wasn't textbook military protocol. It was stubborn, it was audacious, and it was completely unexpected. It baffled the Germans. While they waited for a formal reply, the Americans dug in deeper. The soft American soldiers held the line until reinforcements could arrive, ultimately dooming Hitler's last gamble. They saw democracy as weak, individualism as chaotic, and diversity as a fatal flaw. They fundamentally misunderstood what motivated the American soldier. He was an individual citizen, a problem solver, a tinkerer, and an innovator who, when pushed, proved to be one of the most resilient and effective soldiers in modern history. The very things the Nazis sneered at: the casual attitude, the diverse backgrounds, the independent spirit, were the very things that allowed the American army to learn, adapt, and ultimately triumph. It is a powerful lesson from history: never underestimate an opponent based on your own rigid prejudices, and never mistake a relaxed demeanor for a lack of resolve. Thanks for watching. If you found this piece of history interesting, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories you might not have heard before. See you in the next one.